Summary of Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele. In his book Whistling Vivaldi, Claude Steele discusses the significant impact that stereotypes have on the behavior of people through his writing. In the beginning, he talks about his childhood in Chicago in the 1950s and the day he really understood that he was black. When Steele tried to use a public pool, he was told that it was only for white people that day. Steele says it's important that he first realized his race when he was being treated badly, like when he was turned away from a hot pool. People judge each other based on who they are, not just their race, but also their class, their age, their health, and so on. In his studies spanning more than 20 years, Steele has found that the fear of a stereotype is so strong that it can change people's behavior. In the 1980s, when Steele was just starting out as a professor at the University of Michigan, he started to look into how assumptions affect behavior. Steele learned at the time that there was a big achievement gap at the university between black and white students. Most of the time, black students did poorly on tests and mostly hung out with other black students. They often thought that their white professors and peers were talking down to them or saying hurtful things by accident. Steele planned a set of tests with another researcher from the University of Michigan to find out how stereotypes affect how students act. At that time, a lot of experts were open to the idea that some groups of people might be genetically less smart than other groups. Steele and another professor, Stephen Spencer, wanted to test this idea, even though they didn't think it was real and actually hated it. Spencer and Steele thought that just the fear of fitting in with a stereotype could keep minority students from paying attention on a test, which would cause them to do poorly. When women were told to take a math test that was supposed to show how smart they were, they did much worse than men. Women did just as well as men on the test when they were told that it hadn't been shown to show any differences between the sexes. Steele thought this result meant that the fact that the female subjects might fit a stereotype, that is, being bad at math, was enough to make them anxious and slow down their thinking. Steele knew, though, that more study was needed. Steele and his colleagues did more research over the next few years, which suggested that the fear of a stereotype was a major reason why many groups, not just women, did worse on tests. When black students were told they were going to be taking an experimental test to see how smart they were, they did worse than white students. This is likely because they were afraid of living up to the stereotype that black students are less smart than white students. Other social psychologists found the same thing about people from working-class backgrounds, Asian Americans, the elderly, and other groups that are highly stereotyped. After Steele went from Michigan to Stanford, he and some of his students did an experiment to see how high school students in the city felt about the threat of stereotypes. They came to the conclusion that stereotype threats had the most powerful effect on the smartest and most motivated test takers who were exposed to that stereotype. Steele slowly drew a picture of stereotypes that was very different from what was written in most psychology books at the time. A lot of social psychologists said that the steady weight of stereotypes made minorities less driven and sure of themselves. Steele, on the other hand, said that stereotype threats showed up in very specific environmental cues that could be measured and, in theory, were cancelled out by other environmental cues. At about the same time, other social psychologists were doing studies that suggested people naturally want to divide into groups and support people in their own group over those in other groups. Steele and his colleagues did more tests that showed that the danger of a stereotype could hurt the performance of a group of test takers in measurable ways, even if the test takers hadn't thought about the stereotype before. Steele talks about some ways that teachers and policymakers can break down stereotypes in the second part of the book. Studies show that students from minority groups tend to work too hard and are less likely to work together with their peers. Reach-out programs that help minority students work with each other and listen to and use constructive comments from their teachers and mentors might help gifted minority students not suffer from overeffort. Steele and some of his co-workers also wanted to know how prejudice affects the body. They did tests that showed the danger of a stereotype could raise blood pressure and heart rate, even if the person who was stereotyped didn't know anything was different. Steele looked into self-affirmation theory to counteract some of the physical effects of stereotyping. To some extent, This idea says that minorities can deal with many stereotype threats by focusing on their beliefs, working hard, and being aware that stereotypes are a part of their lives. Studies of how well students do in public schools show that even a short 15-minute praise activity can make a big difference in the grades of minority students. Steele isn't saying that policymakers should spend more time on self-affirmation drills than on fighting America's systemic inequality. His main point is that the success gap isn't just caused by these real-world differences, it's also caused by psychological problems that are pretty easy to control and lessen. In the same way that Steele says that doctors can't always change the genetic and behavioral factors that cause heart disease, they can still fix the most obvious signs of heart disease, like clogged arteries. In the same way, teachers may not be able to fix racism or sexism that has been around for hundreds of years, but they can help protect their children from some of its effects. At the end, Steele talks about Barack Obama's win in 2008. Some people thought that Obama's victory marked the start of a post-racial America, but Steele comes to a slightly different conclusion. People in the United States shouldn't hide their racial background or act like identity doesn't affect their daily lives. But maybe they should also know that other people's identities shape their lives in the same way that their own identities shape theirs. Finally, Americans might be able to close the success gap if they learn to understand and accept other people's differences and understand that stereotypes hurt everyone in some way.
About the author. Steele was born in Illinois, not far from Chicago. He joined marches with other activists as he grew up and became interested in the civil rights movement. From 1967 to 1973, he went to Ohio State University and got an MA in social psychology and a PhD in statistical psychology. He also graduated from Hiram College with a degree in psychology. Steele taught for almost 20 years at Stanford. After that, he became the president of UC Berkeley. Steele, on the other hand, quit his job in 2016. Steele said he was going to spend more time with his family, but many people thought he quit because of the negative feedback about how he handled sexual harassment cases. Steele's first book was called Whistling Vivaldi, 2010. Since then, he's written a lot of articles about discrimination and stereotypes in schools and the workplace.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.